Hello, and welcome to ELA Plus, your guide to the English language arts. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. In today's video lesson, we're going to read and analyze William Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 6. Sonnet No. 6 is the unofficial anthem of the ultranatalist movement. This is the text you want to share if you're at all interested in boosting fertility rates up above replacement levels and reversing demographic decline. But don't worry, parents. The body nature of exactly how this baby boom is to be achieved is smoothed over by the delightful patina of English Renaissance era diction and the gentle penumbra of Shakespearean metaphor. As such, it provides yet another example of how to employ the English language arts to create high-quality poetry. Let's see how he did it. The first thing that we're going to do in this video lesson is read Sonnet No. 6. After that, I'll offer you a plain English contemporary version so you at least have a decent understanding of its surface meaning. And then we'll get right into our analysis. We'll begin our analysis by discussing the various ways that Shakespeare employs imagery to great effect in Sonnet No. 6. After that, we'll talk about the poem's Phonaesthetics, with particular attention given to its use of rhymes, consonance, and alliteration. And then we're going to have a very interesting discussion about the differences in pronunciation between early modern English and contemporary English. And we'll look at the ways that using contemporary English enhances our phonaesthetic appreciation of the poem, and how maybe also using the original pronunciation could enhance our phonaesthetic appreciation of the poem. And after all that, we'll conclude with some comprehension questions. Let's get to it. As you may already know, we have a method for reading poetry here at ELA+. The first step of the method is read the poem silently to yourself. The second step of the method is to read the poem aloud. If you want to learn about the other steps in this method, please see our video lesson, How to Read a Poem. It's linked to down in the description. For those of you who have not yet read Sonnet No. 6 to yourselves, please do so now. I really can't stress enough how important it is to read the poem to yourself first. Perhaps the most powerful part of poetry is the individual's experience with it, and you can't get this unless you read the poem. So if you haven't already, pause the video now and give it a read. Okay, for those of you who have already read the poem, great, thanks for doing so, and now we can read the poem together aloud. Then let not winter's ragged hand deface in thee thy summer ere thou be distilled. Make sweet some vial. Treasure thou some place with beauty's treasure ere it be self-killed. That use is not forbidden usury which happies those that pay the willing loan. That's for thyself to breed another thee, or 10 times happier, be it 10 for 1. 10 times thyself were happier than thou art, if 10 of thine 10 times refigured thee. Then what could death do if thou shouldst depart, leaving thee living in posterity? Be not self-willed, for thou art much too fair to be death's conquest and make worms thine heir. All right, that's Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 6. If we were to translate it into a contemporary plain English version, it might look a little something like this. Do not allow winter to destroy your summer beauty before you've had an opportunity to distill that beauty. The way to do this is to make some woman pregnant, and if you don't do this, your beauty will die with you. It's not illegal to charge interest on this particular loan, the loaning of your body to a woman for procreative purposes, because that woman will happily repay the loan with a child, giving you offspring, which will make the both of you happy. In fact, having 10 children will make you 10 times happier. And what power could death possibly have over you if you leave behind such an abundant legacy? Please do not be selfish. You are simply too beautiful to be conquered by death and leave behind on earth only a meal for worms. Okay, so now that we've read the poem aloud and we've developed a plain English contemporary version, it's now time to get into our analysis. We'll start, quite naturally, at the top. I love this opening line. I love this opening quatrain. Then let not winter's ragged hand deface in thee thy summer ere thou be distilled. Make sweet some vial. Treasure thou some place with beauty's treasure ere it be self-killed. Ere we get to the important stuff, it's probably best first to define the archaic word that we encounter in this quatrain, and that archaic word, of course, is the word ere. Now, the word air is probably not used by non-insane people regularly in their everyday speech. You've probably never encountered it before in your life, so it may have tripped you up a little bit as you were reading this poem. But that's okay. ELA Plus is here for you. The word air is a preposition, and it means before. So what the speaker is saying to the young man in quatrain number 1 is, do not let winter destroy your summer beauty before it can be distilled. Get some woman pregnant before you get yourself killed. And so, having cleared that up, we can now get to our analysis proper. I'd like to start with the imagery. For me, the imagery of this quatrain is its most evocative aspect. Truly stellar stuff here. I mean, just take a look. Winter's ragged hand. Come on, it's a great way to open a poem. It populates the mind with all types of harrowing images of a malicious, decrepit hand clawing at a beautiful face. You know, like the Night King from Game of Thrones coming at you in your nightmares. Spooky. But then the speaker immediately switches things up. He begins to talk about how the young man's beauty will make sweet some vial and treasure some place with beauty's treasure. I love these lines. Here we have the introduction of pleasant imagery. Sweet vials, beauty's treasure. These both strike a sharp contrast against winter's ragged hand. And in addition to being quite wonderful examples of poetic imagery, they also show us how Shakespeare will use metaphor to bowdlerize the sexual act. To bowdlerize is to remove content that is considered objectionable or indecent by either expurgation or alteration. Typically, as here in Sonnet number 6, bowdlerization is employed to remove content of a sexual nature. That is exactly what Shakespeare is doing here by using these metaphors of vial and treasure. He's talking about sex. According to Stephen Booth, to make sweet some vial means to impregnate some womb. The vial, the womb, is made sweet by putting inside of it the young man's beauty. So how to do this? Well, we all know how to do this, I'm sure, and so did Shakespeare. He had 3 children after all. But the norms of literature at the time precluded him from being explicit about it. So he had to bowdlerize this process by using these metaphors of vial and treasure. Now, treasure, it should be pointed out, is not a noun in Sonnet number 6. As Catherine Duncan Jones points out in The Ardent Shakespeare, it's actually a verb. What treasure means, what it refers to in Sonnet number 6, is semen, ejaculation. This isn't the only time in the works of Shakespeare where we see the word treasure employed as a metaphor for semen. As Duncan Jones points out, Shakespeare does just this in the play Othello. In Act 4, Scene 3 of that play, we have Desdemona, who is Othello's wife, preparing for bed with her maidservant Emilia. As they're getting ready for bed, Emilia and Desdemona are speaking on the subject of marital fidelity. It's Desdemona's opinion that women will never cheat on their husbands. Emilia, on the other hand, has a different set of ideas, and she lists the reasons why women might cheat. Among those reasons, she says, "But I do think it is their husbands' faults if wives do fall. Say that they slack their duties and pour our treasures into foreign laps." Pour our treasures into foreign laps. Emilia really coming in hot with Mia Khalifa levels of sexual impropriety. And on that bawdy note, we conclude our discussion of the diction and metaphor of the first quatrain and move on to talking about the quatrain's phonaesthetics. Phonaesthetics is a term first used by J.R.R. Tolkien, and it means the study of the pleasantness or beauty of sound in language. So when we talk about phonaesthetics, what we're talking about is the pleasing way in which certain spoken sounds fall upon the human ear. Poets have a bevy of phonaesthetical tools at their disposal. Shakespeare, naturally, is a master of them all. Let's look at this first quatrain for some examples. The most obvious example of phonaesthetics here, this is a sonnet after all, is the rhyme scheme. And this is the Shakespearean or English sonnet, so the rhyme scheme for the first quatrain is A, B, A, B. The A rhymes are deface and place, and the B rhymes are distilled and self-killed. Now there are a few things that I want to talk about when it comes to these rhymes. The first thing is that the rhymes of this quatrain are what we call exact rhymes. An exact rhyme is a rhyme that features the repetition of identical vowel sounds in a syllable whose initial consonant sound, if any, is different, but whose final consonant sound, if any, is the same. So for an example, let's look to rhyme A of this quatrain. We have the words rhymed deface and place. Well, here we have the repetition of the identical vowel sound of the long A, followed by the final consonant sound of the soft C. Likewise, rhymes B is also an exact rhyme. Here we have the words distilled and self-killed. Do you see it? What makes this an exact rhyme is we have the repetition of the long I vowel sound, followed by the final consonant sound of D. Another thing about these rhymes, and this is going to be true about all rhymes written in iambic pentameter, is that they are masculine rhymes. A masculine rhyme is a rhyme where the rhyming syllable is the stressed syllable. Masculine rhymes typically are punchier, they're stronger, I think, and more pleasing to listen to. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about in terms of the rhymes of this quatrain is that, for me at least, there's a certain way to read a Shakespearean sonnet so as to amplify the euphonic nature of the rhyme scheme. There's a way to read it, that is, to make it more phonaesthetically pleasing. As we already know, the Shakespearean or English sonnet, like sonnet number 6, features a rhyme scheme of AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG. If you're unfamiliar with this fact, please see our video lesson, Introduction to the English Sonnet. It's linked to down in the description. Now, in my opinion, the Shakespearean sonnet provides readers with a much more delightsome reading experience than the Petrarchan or Italian sonnet, especially if you read it the way that I'm about to show you. As you can see, I've highlighted the rhyme scheme of sonnet number 6 for you here, between alternating colors of blue and yellow. The blue represents the first rhyme, the yellow represents the second rhyme, and you can see that this is repeated through all the 3 quatrains. This, of course, is the AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF rhyme scheme of the Shakespearean sonnet. Now, when you're reading a Shakespearean sonnet, what you want to do, generally, not always, but what you want to do is you want to emphasize the yellow rhymes, that is, the second rhymes, the B, D, F. And not only do you want to emphasize these rhymes, what you want to do also is to pause after reading that particular rhyme. Conversely, with the ACE rhymes, those highlighted in blue here, you don't want to emphasize these rhymes, and you want to not pause after the line. Just keep going. This is a way to accentuate the phonaesthetical nature of the Shakespearean sonnet's rhyme scheme. And as it turns out, Shakespeare uses punctuation to guide the reader to read sonnet number 6 exactly in this fashion. Let's take a look at the first quatrain. What you'll see here is that lines 1 and 2 are enjambed. Enjambment, if you'll recall, is when one line of poetry runs into another line of poetry with no stopping and no punctuation. Okay? So you'd read lines 1 and 2 like this. Then let not winter's ragged hand deface in thee thy summer ere thou be distilled. So there's no pause whatsoever. But you'll do note that line 2 ends with a colon. So with a colon, we're going to take a little bit of a beat. We're going to pause for just a little bit before moving on. So we see it's just like how I told you to read the poem before. You're not going to emphasize or pause after the first rhyme, but you are going to emphasize and pause after the second rhyme. And in fact, we see this pattern repeated in lines 3 and 4. Lines 3 and 4, as you can see, are also enjambed, and line 4 ends with a period, so we take another beat. Shakespeare continues with this pattern throughout the remaining quatrains of sonnet number 6. You'll see here that in lines 5 and 6, they're enjambed, but line 6 ends with a semicolon. So you're going to have a little bit of a beat. Line 7, it does have a comma, but a comma, remember, has a little bit more of a beat than nothing, but definitely less of a beat than a semicolon or a period. And the period is what concludes this second quatrain, so you're definitely going to emphasize and pause when you get to that point. This final quatrain, as you can see, features no enjambment, but it does have a comma after line 9 and after line 11, and a comma, of course, is going to provide for a shorter beat than the colon, which concludes line 10, or the question mark, which concludes the quatrain and line 12. So in summation, What you want to do when reading a Shakespearean sonnet is you want to emphasize and pause after the rhymes found in the second rhyme. That is, the B, the D, and the F rhyme. With the ACE rhymes, the first rhymes, you don't want to emphasize these, and you don't want to pause, generally speaking, as you go to the next line. This is a way to accentuate the euphonic nature of a Shakespearean sonnet. But what can I say? I love rhyme. I mean, I was brought up on Pac, Biggie, Wu-Tang, Outkast, and of course my man Billy Shakes, so I love rhymes. So that's rhyme. But there's another phonaesthetical tool that Shakespeare uses to great effect in the opening quatrain of Sonnet No. 6. And here I'm talking about the English language art of consonance. Consonance is the repetition in closely clustered words of identical or similar consonant sounds. Throughout this opening quatrain, 10 times in fact, that's at least twice per line, we have an instance of consonance and the repetition of the S sound. And I've highlighted this S sound here for you in the opening quatrain. Two things about consonance. One, it's much more subtle than an exact masculine rhyme. Consonance really doesn't draw attention to itself, for the most part, but it is there, and people find it pleasing to listen to and to read. Two, consonance can be made much more palpable, much more obvious, and much more robust if the repetition of the consonant sound appears at the beginning of a word. If the repetition of the consonant sound appears at the beginning of the word, this is what we call alliteration. And we have an example of alliteration in Sonnet No. 6, but it doesn't appear until the third quatrain, so we'll get to it shortly. For now, what I'd like to do in our conclusion of our analysis of the opening quatrain is look at how it connects us to our previous sonnet, Sonnet No. 5. Remember how we left things in our video lesson for Sonnet No. 5. We said that Sonnets 5 and 6 should be read as a sonnet sequence within the larger sonnet cycle as a whole. So if you haven't already read Sonnet No. 5, nor watched our video lesson on it, please do both of those things now so you have some idea of what we're talking about. Okay, so Sonnet No. 6 continues from Sonnet No. 5 in a few ways. First, it continues with some of the metaphorical tropes, the most obvious of which is the metaphor of winter as ragged death, contrasted against summer as youthful beauty. And we also have this metaphor of distillation. In both of the sonnets, the young man is told by the speaker that he should distill his youthful beauty. Now in Sonnet No. 5, it was left unclear exactly what the speaker meant by distillation. What he means is made quite clear now, however, in Sonnet No. 6. What the speaker wants the young man to do is to impregnate some woman. That's what the speaker is talking about when he says that he wants to see the young man's essence distilled. The young man's distillation will be his children. So that's how the opening quatrain of Sonnet No. 6 connects us to Sonnet No. 5. Let's now begin our analysis of the second quatrain. The second quatrain reads, "That use is not forbidden usury, which happies those that pay the willing loan. That's for thyself to make another thee, or 10 times happier, be it 10 for 1. Okay, so there are 3 things that I want to talk about concerning this second quatrain. The first thing is the rhyme scheme. As discussed above, a Shakespearean or English sonnet should have the second quatrain follow the rhyme scheme CD, CD. And that's what we have here. Or is it? In lines 5 and 7, Shakespeare rhymes the words usury and thee. It's kind of an odd rhyme, but it is an exact rhyme nonetheless because each word concludes with the vowel sound long E. What about lines 6 and 8? Do the words lone and one rhyme? Lone, one. Well, there's a few different ways to look at this. First, these are definitely not exact rhymes. Exact rhymes, remember, are rhymes that feature the repetition of identical vowel sounds in a syllable with an initial consonant sound, if any, that differ, and a final consonant sound, if any, that are the same. So here we have different vowel sounds, so they're not exact. The word lone has the long O vowel sound, and the word one has the schwa vowel sound. Now schwa is interesting. I don't want to get into it and what it means exactly. We can also just say that one has the short U or vowel sound. So lone, long O, one, short U vowel sound. So they're not identical vowel sounds, but they still could be a rhyme. And the reason that they're a rhyme is because they end with a similar consonant sound, the N sound. And when two words rhymed with each other feature different vowel sounds, but they conclude with the identical consonant sound, this type of rhyme is called consonantal rhyme. So we can say that Shakespeare is using consonantal rhymes in Sonnet No. 6. If you've been reading these poems with us, you may have noticed that Shakespeare tends to use a lot of consonantal rhyme. You may have also noticed that consonantal rhyme isn't as punchy as an exact rhyme. Why would Shakespeare do this? Why would he sacrifice the powerful phonaesthetical tool of exact rhyme, especially within a format of the sonnet which demands such a powerful rhyme? Well, I'm here to tell you that he's not abandoning exact rhyme for consonantal rhyme. Contemporary readers only experience his poetry as being consonantal rhyme rich because of the various phonological changes that have occurred between Shakespeare's time of early modern English and our own time of contemporary English. And to understand this dynamic better, let's take a quick look at some of the work of David Crystal. David Crystal is a British linguist who focuses primarily on the linguistics of the English language, and you know he's a serious person because he has a beard and glasses, just like you know I'm a serious person because I wear a jacket and a tie. And here's what David Crystal has to say about the supposed lack of exact rhyme in the works of William Shakespeare. When we look at the whole sequence, we find a remarkable 142 rhyme pairs that clash, 13% of all lines. Moreover, these are found in 96 of the sonnets. In some, only a third of the sonnets rhyme perfectly in modern English. And in 18 instances, it is the final couplet which fails to work, leaving a particularly bad taste in the ear. There are three possible explanations. 1. Shakespeare was not as good a poet as we thought, especially when it comes to finding rhymes. 2. Shakespeare is making copious use of visual rhymes. 3. The pronunciation of certain words has changed between early modern English and today, so that these lines would have rhymed in Shakespeare's time. I disregard the first explanation, and I'm totally committed to the third. Going more into the weeds on the phonological evolution of the English language falls outside the ambit of this particular video lesson, so I'm not going to do it. However, I will link you down in the description to David Crystal's paper. It's actually quite fascinating to look at, and it might help you enjoy these sonnets better, because what he does is he provides an early modern English pronunciation guide to the 142 supposedly clashing rhymes that we find in the Shakespeare sonnet cycle. So, as it pertains to Sonnet No. 6, Quatrain 2, what you'll find in David Crystal's paper is that the word lone originally was pronounced with a short U vowel sound. So the word, as Shakespeare would have pronounced it, would be lun, not lone, as we pronounce it. So therefore, lone and one would rhyme. Lun, one. So you might be asking yourself right now, hey Brian, if Shakespeare himself intended these poems to be read with original pronunciation, and if indeed original pronunciation preserves the exact rhymes, then why not use original pronunciation in your reading of the poems in your video lessons? Okay, it's a good question. After all, sacrificing 13% of the exact rhymes does compromise a bit the phonaesthetical value that we derive from reading these poems. And I gave this a lot of thought, but in the end, during my preparation for these videos, I decided to go with contemporary English when I read them. And the reason for that is because I believe that going with contemporary English is less disarming than going with original pronunciation. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to use contemporary English as we read Shakespeare's poems. But I could have made the wrong decision. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Alright, so the second thing that I'd like to draw your attention to in this quatrain is Shakespeare's use of verbification or conversion. In linguistics, conversion is the creation of a word from another word with no change in form. Verbification is a particular type of conversion where we create a verb from an existing noun, adjective, or some other word. We see an example of verbification in line 6 with the word happies. Happy, of course, is an adjective, and it's meant to describe the feeling of well-being or contentedness, or maybe even the feeling of being favored by luck or fortune. In Sonnet 6, however, Shakespeare engages in a little bit of verbification and changes this adjective into a verb. This particular verbification achieves at least two things. First, phonaesthetically speaking, it maintains the iambic pentameter of the line. Secondly, there's a certain freshness and originality to verbification. It's a much more animated form of expression. It imbues the verb with the emotional content of the adjective. So if we look at happies, if Shakespeare were to say that the young man would be made happy, that happiness is coming from outside of the young man. He's being made happy. But if he's happied, the happiness is emanating from within him. And the final thing that I'd like to point out about this quatrain is that Shakespeare has returned once again to commercial metaphor when discussing his themes of love and lovemaking. So, we've only read 6 of the sonnets so far, and in 3 of them, that's half, he's used commercial metaphor to talk about this subject. Curious. So where do we find this commercial metaphor in sonnet number 6? Well, we find it in the words use and usury. And it should be noted that usury was illegal in England almost up until the time of Shakespeare's writing of these sonnets. So it was legal to lend money at this time, but it was still considered sinful. So what the speaker is saying to the young man is that sexual activity is not sinful if it's used for reproductive purposes. And then finally, we have this idea of happy people paying the willing loan. This is also a commercial metaphor. What does this mean? Well, according to Stephen Booth, what this means is that women borrow something from men and then 9 months later pay it back with interest. Ceaselessly crying, pooping, sleeping, eating, but infinitely beautiful interest. And that brings us to the final quatrain. This quatrain reads, 10 times thyself were happier than thou art, if 10 of thine 10 times refigured thee. Then what could death do if thou shouldst depart, leaving thee living in posterity? Okay, pop quiz. Earlier in this video lesson, we talked about consonants. Can you identify the consonants that Shakespeare uses in this quatrain? If you identified either the th sound with the consonant team of th or the t sound, then go ahead and pat yourself on the back. You identified the consonants in this quatrain. This consonance is mellifluous. It provides a delightful, phonaesthetically pleasing reading experience for the reader. But it's not the most striking aspect of this quatrain. The most striking aspect of this quatrain is that the speaker wants the young man to reproduce 10 times. 10 times, wow. And not only that, the speaker wants the young man's offspring to themselves reproduce 10 times. And this is what I was talking about in the introduction to the video lesson when I said that sonnet number 6 is the unofficial anthem of the ultra-natalist movement. Because the speaker not only wants the young man to reproduce, he wants him to reproduce on a pre-industrial revolution scale. Not bad. Sounds like fun. Having suggested that the young man make 10 children, he then concludes the quatrain with a rhetorical question. Then what could death do if thou shouldst depart, leaving thee living in posterity? What a fantastic conclusion to this quatrain. First of all, the speaker has addressed the 2 major concerns of these procreation sonnets. How to preserve the young man's beauty on the one hand, and how to cheat death on the other. It's through procreation, according to the speaker, that both of these objectives are obtained. Now, what makes Shakespeare so fine a poet is that he not only treats these weighty philosophical issues in his poetry, but he does so in a ravishing manner, drawing from his deep English language arts toolkit. So for example, we've already spoken about the use of consonants in this quatrain, and now we're going to see an instance of alliteration. Alliteration, remember, is the repetition of identical consonant sounds at the beginning of closely clustered words. We see an example of this with the phrase, leaving thee living. This is just a little bit of alliteration, nothing too fancy. It's kind of like the phonaesthetic equivalent of a gratifying garnish upon a delectable cocktail. Too much alliteration draws attention to itself, but just the right amount, like what we have here in Sonnet number 6, and alliteration will add flavor to the poem, but not overwhelm it. Leaving thee living could very well be the most subtly complex phrase in the entire sonnet cycle. Stephen Booth points out that there are at least 4 ways to read just this one sentence. First, leaving indicates the condition in which the object of the sentence is found at the time of departure. The time of departure, of course, is death. The object, of course, is thee, who is the young man. So how could the young man be left living at the time of death? Well, he's left living through his progeny, through his children. Secondly, leaving can also pun with the word depart found in line 11. Thirdly, there's this notion of leaving as bequeathing, leaving something behind. What the young man is leaving behind, what he's bequeathing, is his genetic heritage. This is the beauty that the speaker is so obsessed about in these procreation sonnets. Fourthly, and this one blew my mind, it's like Game 6 of the 86 World Series. If we read leaving as the present participle of the verb to leave, then that is, to grow leaves, then we have the leaving these living in posterity being the young man's children. The 10 children are the leaving these. And this isn't an English major stretch either. It actually fits with the logic of the poem. Recall, sonnets 5 and 6 are connected and should be read as one sonnet sequence within the collection as a whole. With that in mind, remember that Sonnet 5 features a line about winter making the young man's lusty leaves quite gone. The botanical metaphor is part of what connects the 2 sonnets. Further, as we discussed in our video lesson for Sonnet number 5, one of the major thematic elements of that poem was the cyclical nature of human existence. Well, here we find that cycle in effect. Procreation will extend the life cycle of the young man's genes. Yes, he will lose his lusty leaves as he withers and dies, but in the youth of his children, those leaves return. And in addition to Booth, I'd just like to add one more understanding of this word leaving. Leaving as a noun. When leaving is read as a noun, what this means is something that is left, a relic, a remnant, a residue, like the leavings of crumbs on your dinner plate after you're done eating a meal. In this context, the leavings are the 10 children. And that's about it for quatrain number 3. Let's wrap things up by looking at the concluding couplet. The concluding couplet reads, "Be not self-willed, for thou art much too fair, to be death's conquest, and make worms thine heir." All right. Well, first off, Don Patterson calls this entire sonnet poetic hackwork. Further, he goes on to write, quote, "The last line is a contender for the worst in all the sonnets, and certainly the most musically incoherent." Once again, this man is just completely wrong. This last line rips. We have the exact masculine rhyme of fair and heir. We have the traditional rhythm of iambic pentameter. I mean, what more do you want, Donnie? The diction is also superb. Make worms thine heir. Death's conquest. These go hard. I'd also point out that the phrase self-willed phonaesthetically calls us back to the expression self-killed found earlier in the sonnet. It's a nice little callback. Speaking of which, this is the part of the video lesson where I draw your attention to the couplet tie and where it appears in this particular sonnet. So let's go ahead and do that. It turns out there's 3 of them in this poem. We have make in lines 3 and 14. We have will with willing and willed in lines 6 and 13 respectively. And then we have death in lines 11 and 14. Make, will, death. That's sound advice for estate planning. All right, very well. That's our video lesson for William Shakespeare's Sonnet number 6. I hope you enjoyed it. In this video lesson, the first thing we did was read the poem, and then I offered you a plain English contemporary version of the poem, and then we got into our close reading analysis, where we focused on first the imagery, and then the phonaesthetics, with particular attention to rhyme, consonance, and alliteration. We also discussed for a little bit the differences in pronunciation between early modern English and contemporary English. And now, I'll leave you with some comprehension questions. Number 1. What is your opinion of this poem? Number 2. What is an exact rhyme? Number 3. What is a consonantal rhyme? Number 4. What does bowdlerize mean? Number 5. What is alliteration? And number 6. What is consonance? In the third quatrain, there's another example of consonance that I didn't cover in the video lesson. Can you identify it? This concludes our lesson on Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 6. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something from it. If you did, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. To that end, also consider sharing it with friends, fellow students, and even your English teacher. Also, feel free to ask me any questions about this video if you have any. Remember that ELA Plus is your YouTube guide to English studies. Subscribe to learn more. Until our next lesson, keep reading and take care of yourselves and others. Thank you.